someone depends on us, there's a lot of pressure associated with that, right? For some of us, it could be putting dinner on the table. It could be paying the bills. It could be caring for a loved one. For others of us, it could be listening to a friend who is going through a struggle. But it comes with a lot of responsibility. Pastor Tim shares with us today how Jesus is the only one who provides everything we need.
So today we're talking about God is provider. And so in Genesis chapter 22, there's this story that illustrates how God will provide for all of his children. In Genesis 22, it's about a father and a son, Abraham and his son Isaac, and they're going up to the top of this hill, the top of this mountain, to make a sacrifice. Now, Abraham knows exactly what he's been called to do, which is God has told him to sacrifice his son on an altar, right? Okay, so, but it says in Verse 8, Abraham answered his son. His son had asked, like, hey, where's the lamb? We've got the wood, we've got the fire, we got everything we need for this sacrifice, but we don't have a lamb to make the sacrifice out of. And Abraham tells him, he says, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. And so here it is, like Abraham knows two things, right? He knows two things. He knows that God has promised to make him the father of a great nation and that Isaac is the next in line. And so if he dies, the dream of this great nation dies. So he knows these two things. They seem contradictory. You're going to be a great nation through this son, Isaac. Oh, and I want you to kill your son, Isaac. It says in Hebrews 11:17, it says, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise from the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So he trusted that God would figure out how to provide. Even if it meant that he was going to sacrifice Isaac and that God was going to raise Isaac back from the dead, Abraham knew that God would provide. He just needed to be obedient. Well, in the end of the story, as they get to the top of the mountain, they set up the sacrifice, and Abraham's going to do it. He's going to follow through and sacrifice Isaac. But if you've read it, you know there's a voice that says to stop, and Abraham stops, and he doesn't kill Isaac. And then he looks over into the bushes, and he sees that there is a ram that has been provided, that God has sent a ram for the sacrifice. God provided the sacrifice. Abraham's words become true again and again and again throughout Scripture, that God will provide. God will provide. Here's the thing, though. Abraham knew that God was going to provide, but he also knew that he just needed to obey. And those two things tend to walk hand in glove, our obedience and God's provision. We should never feel like we need to compromise the words of God in order to receive or maintain the blessings of God. And that's a tough lesson. It was a tough lesson for Abraham to learn. It's a tough lesson for us to learn. We also need to seek the provider over the promises. It's really easy to get encouraged by the promises that God makes us in His Scripture. But let's think about it. A promise's value is not in the promise. A promise's value is in who made the promise, right? If someone you don't know makes you a big promise, you don't necessarily believe them because you don't know that you can trust them. But if someone that you would give, you would trust with your own life makes you a promise, you trust that they'll come through with it. We don't need to so much focus on the promises that God has made us as much as we need to focus on the provider of those promises. Abraham didn't trust the promises of God. Abraham trusted God. It sounds subtle, but that's a big difference. God is a constant provider, not a one-time provider or an occasional provider. He's constantly providing for us. We just don't always see what he's doing. We don't always see how he's provided for us. A pastor that I like to listen to, he put it this way. He said, God is always doing 10,000 things in your life, but you may only be aware of 3 of them. So as we move into our groups, let's take some time to thank God for his provision, even in the ways that we didn't notice.